office today, as a matter of fact. And welcome to our program on gender and mediation. This is a program with the two official presenters and two co-sponsors. The presenters are the Women's Bar Association and the Massachusetts Black Women Attorneys here in Massachusetts. My co-chair of the WBA ADR committee is with us today, Jessica Block. Hello, Jessica. Wave to everybody. And we started the ADR committee of the WBA and welcome people to join us who are interested in that. We can talk more about that later. And I wanted to welcome everybody to JAMS. If it wasn't COVID, you'd all be here and we'd be having a wine and cheese reception after the program. That was the plan. The COVID numbers ticked up. People became understandably concerned. So here we are still in the virtual world, but we'll make up for it at some point with Andrea leading the way again. So I wanted to, though, welcome you to JAMS. JAMS has quite a commitment to diversity. We were the first ADR organization to have a full-time diversity manager, Joanne St. Louis. And just as one example of our many diversity programs, we recently sponsored with the MBLA here in Massachusetts, a program on how to become a mediator. So this is all part of something that JAMS supports quite extensively and sincerely, and we love having the opportunity to help out in connection with our program here tonight. Now, a few technical issues. As you may have seen, the program is being recorded. If you participate, you're consenting to that. Sorry, I had to be a little legalistic there. We are using the Zoom video conference platform. You can see that if you press your gallery view as opposed to speaker view, you can see everybody who's participating, and that's because we're going to have breakout rooms after a program of 40 minutes or so. We also ask that since everybody can see each other and hear each other, that you mute yourselves until we move into those breakout rooms. That will be very helpful. Please put any questions into the chat at the bottom of your screen. And that's it. I've already reminded you that the program is being recorded, and I cannot, though, hand it over to our wonderful moderator, Andrea Kramer, without thanking Andrea. As a result of speaking for myself, COVID, surgery, and other issues, Jessica and I both at exactly the wrong time were out of commission, work, et cetera, and Andrea stepped into the breach. So thank you, Andrea Kramer. Clap, clap, clap. I don't know how to do my reactions at this point, but really a sincere thank you. You pulled it together and we're looking forward to a wonderful program. So I'm handing it over to you.
Well, thank you, Conna, and thank you, JAMS, for hosting us. And if we were in person, we wouldn't be waiting till the reception to start on the wine. I suspect the conversation would go even a little bit better. But with that said, please pour yourself a glass of whatever you'd like. As you saw, I had my tea, so I should be good and hyped up. For those of you who know me as a very low-key, low-energy person. And anyway, I am thrilled to be doing this program. First of all, the panel that I get to work with is such a privilege and a pleasure, and I will introduce them to you in a moment. Gender issues, as those of you who know me know, are close and near and dear to my heart. And the way this came about was I was actually doing some business litigation and thinking about the proper mediator for a dispute in a closely held company that involved was male and female co-owners. My client was female, just coincidentally. I represent men too. I have great male clients, but this one was female. And the only way I could really understand the dynamic was to see that the male partner treated her as a work wife. And that was coming through in the mediation. Anytime she asked for anything, the negotiations, I should say ahead of time, anytime she asked for anything, he accused her of whining or complaining. He was taking credit for everything she did while he, symbolically sat back, smoked a cigar, and had his slippers on at the end of the day. And so we needed a mediator who would not replicate those dynamics, or at least be, if not conscious of them, at least not allow them to sort of permeate things. And it was just at the time when Jessica and Conna were on a program with me and they said, oh, we need to come up with a topic. And I was like, oh, how about gender and mediation? And you know how it is, you offer something and then you're the one coordinating it. But it's great because ever since then, I've been really thinking about this. And I would say that in thinking about it and in talking to the phenomenal panelists, gender mediation come out in many different ways. So first of all, you could look at it from the role, from the different roles in a mediation. One is the mediator, the second is the advocate, and the third is the client. And what we're going to do is the first half hour of this program, we're going to talk about gender issues, not just gender dynamics in each of those three contexts. And we will have two panelists sort of be primary for those, and I will ask questions. They'll answer it from their experiences. And you guys can jump in with a question and whatever. Then we're going to go into rooms. You can talk with among yourselves, and there'll be a panelist there with you to help moderate that and facilitate that. So we'll do that, and then we'll come back and share our thoughts in later discussion with you guys directing questions to us or us directing questions to you. This is really meant as an exploration. We don't have answers for you. This is not something you're going to walk away going, oh, I learned this and this. It's going to be food for thought. With you posting the food, well, presenting the food as much as we are. The other way to think about gender is some of the things the panelists have talked about with each other. Gender comes through in stereotypes, whether it's mediators in, let's say, a family law situation, having a stereotype of what the husband does or a wife does, if it's an opposite sex marriage. In assumptions about, people's capabilities, in the power dynamics, in whether you're being heard. Sometimes that comes through with, the best way to get somebody to settle might be to make sure that they feel heard by the mediator, that a very big part of it is being heard. And sometimes it's important to the client in feeling that he or she is heard, to have the mediator be of their class, their protected class is what I mean sort of by that. And here we're talking about gender. I do want to take this moment to say every single one of us, and this is all obvious, but just bear with me, every single one of us has a gender. It doesn't tend to be just women. And every single one of us has intersectionalities. So I am speaking to you right now as a middle-aged, white, Jewish woman, and all of the things, straight, able-bodied most of the time, that come through with that. And people all bring their own backgrounds, whether they're the advocates or the mediators or the clients. And that is really what we're exploring. We're not saying any of this is wrong or bad. We're talking about, sometimes it's actually helpful, sometimes it's hurtful, but all of it we should make more conscious. So that's where we're going with this. With that, I will introduce the panelists. Like I said, we're going to start with considerations of the gender of the mediator, and that's going to be Jessica Block, an employment lawyer and litigator, a commercial litigator, also a neutral herself, as you've already heard, with Block and Roos. So obviously very experienced in mediation, and Bronwyn Roberts of Cooley, who has been practicing for a few decades, and during those has been a business and employment litigator and a business counselor. Right now, she's focusing more on the counseling and working on employment issues in M&As, but also is a veteran of mediations. The next section relating to gender of the advocate, let's see if we have Conna, who already introduced herself as a neutral from JAMS, and she, like everybody else, will tell you a little bit more about herself. And Desiree Murphy, who is a labor and employment attorney at UMass Memorial, had been in private practice and does mediations in all those contexts. And then last, but absolutely not least, we have Nicole Bluefort of the law offices of Nicole Bluefort, who does family, probate, criminal defense, and general litigation. And Tiffanie Ellis-Niles of the law firm of, and I will say one of my favorite names of law firms, Lyles and Niles. And they do family and bankruptcy law, also veterans of mediation in those contexts, which is a little bit different from the employment and general litigation. So with no further ado, I'm going to kick it off. And I think I'm going to Jessica first as a neutral and say, with your gender and intersectionalities of race and class and all of those things, what is your perception of, does the gender of the mediator matter? And if so, when?
So I think, as you intimated, it's a very complicated question. Certainly from my perspective as a mediator, I don't feel at this stage, after 40 years of practicing law and being active in the ADR community, that the parties necessarily treat me as the mediator any differently because I am a woman. And in kind of preparing my thoughts, I was reminded about when I was a partner in a 5-attorney firm and all my partners were men. And I remember at one stage, my receptionist said, you know, Jessica, I don't really even think of you as a woman. I don't know. I was taken aback a little bit and she laughed, but I think what she meant was I was treated equally, I had equal power. And so, you know, at least as far as she was concerned, my gender didn't matter. By the time the parties contact the mediator to schedule a mediation, they've already made a number of calculuses. I mean, I have no idea why they chose me. I assume that they choose me because of my areas of expertise that are listed on my website, which I spent a lot of time crafting the content for. And as all of us know who either are mediators or use mediation, users and providers of mediation, there's lots of information about mediators. You talk to your friends, you talk to your colleagues, you've used that mediator before. So there's lots of information. And by the time I'm chosen, I feel comfortable that the parties have felt that I am the person for this particular mediation with my particular mediation style and perhaps my gender, who they're going to trust to help them resolve their dispute. But to answer the question, does the gender of the mediator matter? I don't have a definitive answer, but it may. I think representation is extremely important. We've all recognized this. We celebrated the appointment of Ketanji Jackson to the Supreme Court. I think it often helps. It certainly helped me. I started practicing in the 80s and it helped me to see women on the bench. The lived experience matters. So I think it depends on the case. One thing that's very different about choosing a mediator than choosing a jury, for instance, with a jury, you have like a nanosecond to decide who among all of these people is going to be sympathetic to you and sympathetic to your client. You might have a little bit of voir dire, but you have to make quick snap judgments. And often, we do that based on professions, on gender, race, ethnicity, and depending on the case. But one thing that's different in picking a mediator is this is a totally voluntary practice. And so you want to make sure that the person on the other side, or particularly the party on the other side, is going to feel comfortable with the mediator. So it may well be in certain circumstances. It may not be the case with the lawyers who are attending this, given who is sponsoring this. I mean, you're women, and so there will be sufficient women in the room. But there may be circumstances, for instance, one I had recently, where the plaintiff was a woman, a Black woman. The attorneys were both white men. The person calling the shots on the other side was also a white man, and it was a discrimination case. And, you know, I'm obviously not a Black woman, but I felt like my lived experience may have helped in that case. You know, whether it would have come out the same way or the same outcome with a man, I really don't know. But basically, when the parties enter the mediation room, which more often than not these days is virtual, you know, they've got to feel comfortable. They've got to feel that the mediator will understand them. They've got to, as Andrea said, they've got to be heard. I certainly know one thing that I do when I meet the parties in the council, you know, like everybody else, you make certain snap judgments and assumptions, and then I put those away and let the experience dictate to me, you know, what may really be going on and what I can do with my skills and approach to help the parties get to yes. I do, and just to echo Conna, I know that the big ADR providers and JAMS and the American Arbitration Association, of which I'm on the panel, have done a lot of outreach for diversity. I think in Boston, we lag behind many states in racial diversity, and I'm hoping that's going to change very quickly. So I think,
Okay.
Unless you have some questions.
No, thanks. I want to build on some of that and jump over to Bronwyn, but then I'm hoping that we could have a little bit of back and forth before we have to go to the next question. So Bronwyn, Jessica makes the point that by the time people come to her, they've already chosen her with her gender and her background. So as a practitioner, though, you have been in the role of picking. Yes. So my question is going to be, have you ever, you know, has the gender of the mediator, or at least gender issues around the case, around the mediator, affected how you chose mediators? And also, I know we have spoken, I'm not going to hide the ball here, and also I'm just not gifted enough to sort of pretend that she didn't ask me the question I'm going to ask her, which is to say, you also have some concerns about how our own biases affect how we perceive other people's biases. So first, the first part of it, and then if you could also then add the second part.
Yes. Thanks, Andrea. And as you mentioned, just to sort of set the stage in terms of my practice, I'm doing commercial litigation as well as employment litigation when I'm doing it. Tomorrow, I'm mediating an employment case. Next week, I'm arbitrating a commercial case. But the issue does come up specifically about the gender of the mediator. And I think we really have to ask ourselves, you know, how does questioning the gender of our mediator and the appropriateness for a particular matter sort of depart from, you know, considering the race of our barista or hairstylist? I mean, this is it can be problematic stuff. I have not seen the discussion of the gender of a mediator in commercial situations, but I have seen it in employment. And as Jessica sort of said, you know, these decisions that you know, she's getting engaged, the decision's already been made. My practice, typically doing defense of employment matters, is I really like the plaintiff's counsel to send me a suggestion of the people that they think would be good neutrals, because I think that they have already discussed those individuals with their client and have some level of buy-in with that neutral. And I think that that's a really important thing. I have heard it articulated a lot that we really think it's important to have a female, particularly in gender discrimination cases. And I'm not typically going to upset that if they're telling me this is the slate of people that we would like to mediate in front of. I'm sort of going to accept that because I feel like for my client, we already have a neutral that they have buy-in for. And that can be a huge part of getting to yes. So I don't interrupt that, but I think it's challenging and a little bit tricky because I don't think that counsel's perception or counsel's biases of their own clients' biases are necessarily accurate. And getting to the right mediator for the case, who's the smartest mediator, we're paying a lot of money for it oftentimes, is the most important. And allowing bias for the selection process, I think, is problematic. And I'm not exactly sure how to change it because I want to accept who they're proposing typically. And then I look at qualifications and I ask for recommendations for individuals who have mediated before that neutral. And that's how I narrow it down. But if I was given a slate of all female mediators, I would probably diligence that slate.
Well, so let me follow up. You said you don't really see it in commercial cases. I mentioned one where it was a buyout, and it wasn't actually even the gender of the mediator. For what it's worth, for some of you on here, one of you was my first choice. The other side rejected you for whatever reason. I have my suspicions that it was because of gendered views of you. And I'll just leave it that way. Then there's somebody else I went to on this call, and that person was going to be away. But then when I wound up with the person who they had suggested, I called one of the people on this call to say, hey, will this mediator be open to sort of women being equal partners in the business? And that seemed to me to be important because I think it's not true to know that everybody, I don't think we can assume that every mediator will buy into that. Every judge doesn't buy into that. And that's going to be important for going back and forth. That didn't dictate the gender of the mediator I chose, but it did dictate the sensibilities I was going for. It was a male mediator, and one of the people I had chosen was a male mediator, and one was a female mediator. And I chose both of them because I thought they were excellent. But at the end of the day, I needed somebody who was going to be sensitive to that. Does that ever come up for you in your cases, Bronwyn?
Not like how you've expressed it, Andrea, but I'll be looking for that.
The other case I have, it's a commercial one, it's a breach of contract. One side are bullies, just happen to be male bullies. I've had female bullies, but these are male bullies. But they are described as alpha males. And so when we're thinking about who might mediate that, we need somebody who can deal with an alpha male. Again, somewhat gendered. It doesn't necessarily have to be a man who deals with it, but there is some sense that these men don't really respect women. And some of that comes from language like, oh, the girls in the office. So Jessica, you have any thoughts on that, on that example?
Wow, it's been a really long time since I've been called a girl. So that's my first thought. I think it goes back, and I want to focus on the fact that it's not, the lawyers are often the ones who pick the mediator and recommend the mediator, but I think it's really important to involve the client and get the sense of what the client wants. Almost all providers focus on user experience, and if somebody's not going to have a good experience in the mediation room because they have some quarrel with the mediator, then it's not going to settle. But I guess I have a slight different perspective on alpha males, what you're calling alpha male, in a way that, that may be a trope as well. And I represent a number of people because I do a lot of executive advocacy, so to speak. And I'm often surprised at how much they will listen to me, notwithstanding I have sort of no alpha male characteristics. So again, in the olden days, like in the 1980s, when I started practicing and we had end dispute, and that was the only game in town, and jams, I would often hear from my opposing counsel, we need someone who's going to bash heads together. I mean, I'm not a head basher, so if that's what you want, I'm probably not the right mediator for you. If that's what you're thinking you want, but it may not be really the right approach. And who knows, these quote unquote alpha males may listen to a woman, notwithstanding how you might characterize them.
Thank you. All right, so we'll move to the second question about relating to gender issues around the advocate, the lawyer. So Desiree, I'm going to turn to you first. Study after study has shown that race and gender matter, age, things like that all matter in the courtroom. It's hard to imagine, and they matter everywhere, right? I mean, whether you're heard and whether you're respected. So we have to imagine that it matters in mediation. Have you experienced, or can you speak to ways in which the gender of the advocate, the lawyer, has affected the mediator, either positively or negatively? Affected the mediation, rather, either positively.
No, I get where you're at. You know, from my perspective, and it's similar to Bronwyn, employment law defense work is my primary exposure with mediation. A lot of employment discrimination, which I think brings a lot more of this conversation in terms of that assessment that Bronwyn was talking about, that can be a little bit uncomfortable because you're really having to dig into, you know, does this matter? And if so, why does it matter? And, oh, I feel gross that it does matter, you know? But I think that assessment is necessary because, to your point, while I wouldn't say that, particularly in my experience and my background as a Black female attorney, has necessarily been outcome determinative in a mediation. I do think that it has impacted the process and the dialogue in that mediation. And I do think I can for sure say positively, I've experienced that in the sense of I do believe that my demographics and how they showed up in that particular case, which I'll get to in a minute, was influential in us getting to a place of compromise and getting to that level where we are able to connect on that level of resolution. I think one thing that we talked about when we were thinking about this, you know, panel is, you know, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, you know, if it matters and why does it matter? And in the sense of a defense attorney, that means digging in with the client to find out, like, what really happened here? What really went wrong? And, you know, we can disagree as to whether or not this person was discriminated, treated unfairly, but there was clearly a breakdown in the relationship. And we have to figure out as much as we can, based on what we know about the facts of the situation, but also the personalities at play, what that was. And that leads us to the question of, again, does the identity of who's in the room in terms of the advocate and who's showing up on behalf of the client, does that matter? I'll be honest with everybody in this room, as a defense attorney, I've always walked into the room being like, all right, I'm most certainly going to be the least liked person in this mediation. I'm clearly here for the wrong side. There's going to be little I can do to make people like me. But that said, does, you know, my presence mean something in terms of where my client is in position to this matter? One key way that this oftentimes played out for me in my time during employment discrimination defense was with my cases where the complainant employee was a Black female. And more oftentimes than not, we had this conversation because those were the cases that were the hardest to settle. And anybody who does labor and employment and D&I work knows why that might be, right? Because for a lot of professionals of color, by the time they're reaching an adversarial process, they're fed up. The trust is gone, they're angry, they want, a lot of times, some level of retribution, right? And in addition to a make-whole remedy. And so getting around that requires not only in terms of strategy, in terms of what you're bringing to the table, but how you approach that conversation. And one of the biggest questions we had, and this is pre-COVID, where you had options in terms of how you did your mediation, whether you did it in person or over a phone, we oftentimes ask the question, is it important for me to show up as a Black female in this case and have that conversation with her directly? Will that mean something to this person? And again, to answer that question, we have to really look at how did we get here? What was the breakdown? This person, you know, I had one case where literally the only people that this particular complainant talked to were white. She not dealt with a person of color at that company. And so while I could show up on the phone or even in WebEx, and she could kind of get that sense of who I was, I felt that it was important for her to have that physical presentation of somebody of color coming to the table, not necessarily to say that nothing happened to you or that we understand what happened to you, but my client is serious about listening to you and what you need to resolve this. And again, making that assessment internally and having a discussion with the client, I think definitely yielded positive results in that particular situation because we were able to reach resolution. It obviously came with compromise on both sides, but I do think a key part of that, being able to reach that dialogue or even able to get there, was because there were demographics that made it relatable. The only thing I'll add on, and I think you mentioned it negatively, and I'll be honest, you know, it kind of goes back to what I said before. You know, when I walk into a mediation as defense counsel, there's rarely a time where you know, I think I'm going to win people over. Negatively impacted a mediation because, you know, I think, again, from defense perspective, we have an uphill battle in terms of making inroads into that compromise. That said, I do think that, you know, what it means in terms of how to, what that means for me is, while I can't necessarily pinpoint a piece of my identity that, you know, again, either worked out of my favor or not, I do think that when I get those cues that something's not right, I'm not connecting, and whether that's because I'm Black, whether that's because I'm young, whether that's because I'm a woman, I'm gonna have to transition my approach. I'm gonna have to, you know, try and meet that person where they're at. And, you know, again, I think for better for worse, it requires a level of flexibility that doesn't allow me to kind of focus on, you know, which piece of my identity is at play here. More so, I'm not making that connection. I need to figure out another pathway in. So that's kind of the summary of what I can bring to that table from my perspective. I don't know if Andrea, if there's other corollaries that you want.
Well, there will be more, and I think we'll have to come back because we'll have to come back to it. I will say that you know, there's always, you know, gender studies and stuff all talk about how, you know, different people hear things differently, right? He's aggressive, she's shrill, right? Or he's confident, she's unduly aggressive. And it is absolutely clear to me that there are people who, look, we all know I'm not a shrinking violet, and there are some people who are put off by that and some people who are not. And that is not necessarily along gender lines. But there is a sense, more so earlier in my career, that when I wasn't choosing mediators, when I had the sense that the mediator really just didn't want to hear from me, the male mediator. And that made me less effective in representing my client. And the same way that was talked about in the MBA wellness study, right? If the judge is not respecting you, just like in a mediation, if the mediator is not respecting what you're saying, you're not getting what you need to for the client. Now, the thing is, so in any event, so that said, Conna, I know when we talked, you said because of the nature of your practice, it's often men on both sides, and sometimes it's the women behind the scenes as the in-house counsel and stuff, and sometimes you use gender as a tool for that, and I want to get to that, but so you can answer that, but also the thing that I just posed, which is, do you ever have a sense, maybe from your colleagues, not necessarily from your own experience, but maybe from you, that you hear people differently in a gendered way? Oh, you're muted.
I was being uncharacteristically well behaved. Sorry about that. So you're asking me, do I, as a neutral, perceive advocates in a gendered way?
Correct. And if there's gender issues among the with the advocates, is there anything that you feel like they could do? Like, do you ever see stereotypical sort of, men, what do they call it now? Hyper masculine or, hyper feminine females or trans or LGBT people who don't fit those models, who then, that sort of comes into play.
I'll try to answer that by taking a step back and just setting this, because I think my experience, just because of the cases that come my way, is a little bit adjacent to some of the things that you were saying. So I do employment cases, but my bigger cases in mediation and arbitration tend to come in A, the commercial space, and B, in highly scientific and technical matters, for example, in the life sciences or in healthcare. I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry and in healthcare. I do patent, I do other forms of IP, drug development, collaboration's gone completely and utterly sideways so that everybody hates each other, et cetera, et cetera. Diagnostics, vaccines, all that stuff. So what I tend to see, and getting back to the remark you made first, is there are not many business clients who are women in my cases, but there are quite a few, and this is gratifying to see, quite a few advocates who are women, both outside counsel and inside counsel. And sort of the leveler in my cases, these sorts of cases, not the general commercial cases that I do, which I do, and not the employment stuff, but the life sciences stuff, which I wanted to highlight because it brings a somewhat different spin to some of these issues. Everybody's sort of at the table with a level of expertise that I think diminishes genderization, if I can make that a word, right? If you know your stuff on the patent side, and that's the only kind of person that's going to show up at a mediation of a, a very expensive patent dispute, you've already achieved a level of flexibility, a credibility as an advocate that downplays some of those issues. This is just from my experience. Now, both the inside and the outside counsel females that come before me, women, I'll be frank, as a neutral, I'm always happy to see them because I assume that there will be an additional connection that I can use with them down the road. I assume, and this is my bias, and it's been proven wrong sometimes, that the women advocates, and in particular, the women out inside counsel, who are often the client, all right? Talk about authority. That person has the most authority. It is sometimes my biased view, just admitting it all, and I know I'm being recorded, so I probably shouldn't say this. Sometimes I do feel that in the end, when it's 3 days into it or 2 months, some of these cases that I do last quite some time because we're basically renegotiating a business deal, that person's going to be very reasonable, right? I've got that in my head, and that may not be true. That may not be true, but the gratifying thing I've seen over time is that women often make it to very high places in companies, and they're often the general counsel or the assistant general counsel who goes to the mediation. So when you're the client and you're you're not only, you have your credibility as an expert in that industry, and then you're the client, everybody runs around, including the outside counsel who are men. That person is the person they want to make happy, right? So sometimes these things are flipped in my world because it's the attorneys who are, outside counsel running the show or inside counsel who are the clients, who are often female, and there they are, and the expertise removes some of the genderization issues that might be more prevalent in other areas. And I will also, however, note that the male advocates that I deal with, especially outside counsel, I can see them moderating their approach with me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of people do that in the mediation context anyway. You don't want to look like a jerk in front of the mediator. You want to look reasonable. You want to look like the nice person. You want to make the mediator like you, your case, and your client, right? So as opposed to some arbitrations as they get down the road, especially domestic arbitrations, you know, where there's more of a litigation atmosphere, I think most outside counsel and inside counsel advocates want to start out well, right? But I know as we go down the road, I've had men say to me, I know you think I'm being an idiot, or I know you think I'm being unreasonable. I know you think I'm being an alpha male. Somebody said that to me. Yes. And they pull back sometimes because they know or they perceive that I'm not going to like that, right? One other remark, I think, you know, we've been down, women have succeeded in the law to an extent now, and I think to some extent, a great extent in mediation too. There's a lot more of us around than there used to be. I think what really matters is style and sensibility in many respects, more than gender in certain cases. You know, there are a lot of women who, and sometimes I'm in this category, who, you know, if you're an expert in a type of transaction, that's why people hire me. I can be in a position to say, I have never heard of that provision in a pharmaceutical licensing agreement in my life. That is a quote. I say it as a joke, right? But that's pretty evaluative. And it's not very female, but it's what people hire me to do. Now, you know, I always talk with clients about how they want me to come across and how I'm going to be effective, picking up on what you said, Desiree, right? You know, you want to be able to reach out to people, and you can't just go down that same railroad track if it's not what people want, and it's not going to be effective. So it's really hard to, sometimes you have to switch in midstream. But sometimes I think clients are more concerned about your style and your ability to be sensitive and display sensibility than gender. And people are sophisticated enough these days to understand that women can be tough and men can be perceived to be better listeners. So, you know, I don't know that this would have
and I'm just gonna, and so I'm gonna see if we could just sort of move to, I want to be respectful of the fact that we need to get to the, to the next thing, but you know, you made a point there when I went to go do research for this, because of course I went to do research, and you do gender and mediation. What you're going to find is a whole lot of articles about how women are better as the advocates for the reasons that you said. And I thought, and I had Bronwyn a little bit in my head at the time, but I also thought, I mean, I don't like that kind of essentialism. I've never been very, that's not my brand of feminism. Talking about the universality of gender. And I was interested in that. It is interesting to hear that you sort of are perceiving that. I'm not sure that any mediator who's ever been with me would perceive that I was so very reasonable, or easy to get to yes, but you know, whatever. So that is interesting. You know, I think maybe a lot of the things that I'm calling gender are just the sensitivities to things. And I hope when we come back, the neutrals who are on here, as well as the advocates who are on here, will say some more about it. I asked this question about gender at a program that Judge Hinkle was doing the other day. And she made a comment that she thinks that people actually chose her because she's from the Midwest. And I've actually had two people, Judge Hinkle, who were on that program who loved that answer. I didn't even know you were from the Midwest, but I will keep that in mind going forward. So now we're actually going to move a little from the employment and the commercial, and this was not intentional. But we're going to, I mean, it was intentional to have people from different areas, and we're going to turn to two people who've done more in the family area, where at least my own biases would suggest that gender plays out a lot, but maybe not. And we're going to be talking about the gender of the client. And I know Tiffanie, when we were talking and preparing, you made some very interesting points about how your clients may be perceived differently based on their sex or their gender in the beginning of a mediation. So could you speak to that some?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Andrea. I'm happy to be doing this segment with my partner, Nicole. So yes, I mean, more times than not, I mean, and it's also from the client's perspective, as well, going into a mediation, they feel that, okay, if I'm going to have this female, and depending also on the topic. So, I mean, I do a lot of family work, I do juvenile work and, bankruptcy, as you mentioned, but it just depends on the client and the situation and the topic, basically. So, I mean, for example, in a divorce, which is, what I got held up on today, having a mediator of a certain gender is important for the client. And when you're doing that and you're going into the court, you don't necessarily, get to pick that person. When I talk about a mediator, I'm talking like, probation. So you don't necessarily get to go in on that particular day and say, nope, it's going to be a woman. I absolutely, want a man. You don't get that option. But like some of the other co-panelists have already mentioned, how the mediator or the probation person is, perceiving the client, helps too. If they're feeling like they're having that opportunity to be heard, they're feeling more comfortable with the situation. Because obviously, I mean, we can pick our clients, but I don't necessarily, go around saying I'm only going to represent women. I represent men, I represent women, it just depends again on the situation and the topic. But I think for the client, themselves, depending on the topic, depending on the situation, and also depending on the outcome, they in particular, feel that, just for an example today, we had an outcome where, it was a male judge, female participant, wife, and, the outcome was more favored towards the wife, and automatically my male client thought, oh, it's because, she's a woman. And I'm like, well, I mean, that's your perception, but I mean, the facts, are not that, great either, but it's that perception, and I think they take that to heart, depending on the outcome, that they get. So, I mean, that's it's a factor. And these are kind of, I mean, we're in this position where we can't really control those variables in that certain situation. If we're going into a mediation where we're allowed to choose the mediator, obviously we can have those discussions. And if the client, has a preference, we can make those, recommendations. But I know, I mean, from my situation, and I know it may be similar or different from Nicole, 9 times out of 10, and not only just in family law, it's in my landlord tenant, it's in any situation where you're thrust into mediation that's referred, by the court or by someone else. You're not picking the person who's doing it. So you don't really have control over the gender. So what you really have to focus on with your client, are the facts and, talking to them about how those are going to be perceived and how you're going to present your case. Because very much so with the outcome, obviously they're going to think because this person was of a certain gender, this is why it turned out that way. I mean, those are some of the things I've been seeing.
So it's interesting to me when we all discuss this, and when people, I had discussions with each panelist about going into it, and I feel like we all thought gender mattered a whole lot more than we're presenting now. So apparently, maybe it was my questions. I'm going to try, Nicole. I think we had a conversation earlier. I told you about a story Tiffanie had said about, and where she said that actually often in the family stuff, people, the mediators will sometimes turn to the female about, like, default to the female. All right, I don't have to say anything more. I'm going to turn to you. The thing that, before I say that, the thing that came up in the chat is that given that we did not have 42 people join, the idea was maybe that we would stay in a group, and those of you who are here other than the panelists might jump in after Nicole. So I just wanted to tell the folks at JAMS, I think we might do that, okay? So Nicole, I'm going to turn to you now with that as you were shaking your head.
Sure, yeah, I was shaking my head because I definitely remember the conversation. So I definitely, well, let me start off with this. So we're a general practice firm, as you had mentioned, and we do a lot of variety of different areas, but our bread and butter. We're known for our reputation for certainly family law. So that's from adoption to divorces to looking for child support and custody and those sort of things. And I did want to also make a remark to say kudos to all of us for coming together to have these uncomfortable, sometimes conversations that people don't want to have, that we need to have, and acknowledge what really is, and that there are biases. We all have them. I have them. And, we all have to acknowledge our own personal biases and how we need to control them, right? So, and then also I wanted to highlight that I cannot, even though we're talking about, biases and stuff like that, I think it's also important to note as well that mediation is certainly becoming more and more prevalent, not just in family law, but just all different practice areas. And that as long as you know how to, I think, identify these issues and how to manage the outcome, mediation is still, I don't want to say number one choice, because if you have to go to trial, you have to go to trial, but it's often a recommended outcome for a lot of individuals because of the cost associated with litigation, the fact that you can kind of control the outcome of your case a little bit more, clients feel like they're a lot more in control and all those things. So I just wanted to highlight just those few things before we got rolling. But in regards to kind of just bias in family law, so definitely out of all my practice areas, definitely you can see some gender biases in family law. And of course, in neutrals, from guardian ad litems to, and in this case, mediators, right? So some examples that certainly come to mind is, and I remember the Tiffanie example you were bringing up, Andrea, but ones that particularly come to mind for me in family law is when you're dealing with issues of, let's say, for example, divorces. What's a main issue? Financial matters, right? Why? There's assets involved. You've got the house, you've got bank accounts, you've got things like that. So what I find very interesting when I'm in my mediation sessions, I can't say all the time, but we're here talking frankly about gender bias, right? So what I do find sometimes with the mediators is when it comes to identifying how much is in the bank account and where the bank account is located and how the finances were being handled, I do see some mediators tend to turn to the male to answer those questions versus the female. And how I kind of try my best to manage that is, let's say if I'm in that instance representing the female, the woman in that instance is, making sure that I am up to date on how she handles the finances and showing that she knows just as much in those certain circumstances. So again, not all the cases I've had, but I've seen a lot of instances where they often do look to the male first regarding how finances are being handled and asset allocations and all those sort of things. I also want to say issues of custody. So I can certainly say family law has come a long way, with that. And I think that more and more mediators, the judges, are understanding that males are definitely playing a role in the home, but I definitely still feel that there is a level of bias there. I can think of a very recent example where I had the mediator kind of look at the female, or actually, let me take a step back because I'm saying it correctly. So it was actually the male's complaint, right? So when you go into mediation, this is like through probation, they call it mediation. So it was actually the male's, the male's complaint, the father's complaint for custody. And usually whoever's complaint is initiating the filing here, you go first. It is your complaint. But for whatever reason, they turn to the other side regarding issues of custody and parenting time, and then threw in child support in the mix when she wasn't even asking for it. So that I found to be very interesting. And that's one of many examples of situations where rules of procedure basically are not being followed. And I think that there's still very prevalent in family law is this sort of the caretaking responsibility is, associated with the women, and they're there to kind of speak to that. And some of their wishes are sometimes more kind of followed, the recommendations a little bit more followed than others. I definitely represent, I want to say almost equally as much men and women, but I can say that I certainly still get a number of complaints from men who often feel in mediation as well as in front of judges that, you know, that custody is often goes to the mom, that the mother's feeling, you know, more heard and, you know, things of that nature. But I definitely wanted to offer, while we're here, is just some tips that I thought, or I think is very, very helpful when in those certain situations. And I'm not afraid of calling a mediator on it, right? You can do it in the most professional way possible, but certainly being able to kind of list out the facts. So in that first example, I was kind of mentioning about making sure that I established in that situation, I think it was a divorce example, how the wife knew was just as much information as the husband. So I was able to list the bank accounts of, you know, where the marital assets were. I was able to give information about the mortgage and, you know, things like that, kind of showing in other ways to the mediator that, you know, the wife has the information too, the woman has the information just as much, and that she is just as credible. I do pay attention to cues as well, and whether or not the mediator is taking as much sort of notes and things of that nature. If I feel that the other side is getting more a sort of attention, if you will, or speaking more, I have no problem making note of that. You know, I did notice that this other side got a chance to speak for 20 minutes and you only gave me 10. I'd like the opportunity to have my, you know, my additional time. And as Tiffanie noted, and when you're dealing with family law, mediation is a big part of the process, and you have no control, unfortunately, over who you're going to get. You're going to get a man, you're going to get a woman. You don't know who you're going to deal with. But the good thing about that is you're not bound by it. Although you have to sometimes participate in it before you go to your motion for temporary order hearing, you're not bound by it. So if you don't like the way that it's going, you can certainly decide that, you know, you don't want to deal with the mediator. However, you can keep control over the process for mediation by going into more of a private mediation. And when I do private mediation, that's obviously a cost associated with that. But when you do that, you can be able to look up backgrounds of mediators, which I certainly do. I don't necessarily look at gender so much, and that's the honest truth. I look at their resume, their experience, how long they've been doing family law. I look at reviews, I look at articles that they've commented on, and I really do look for the basics of what a mediator has. Do they have the capabilities of being neutral? Do they have the ability to be able to listen? You know, sort of all those things.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all the panelists. So I think at this point, I'm gonna open it up with some questions to all of you that and the panelists can jump in too, both with comments and with questions. So we'll just have a free for all among the 20-something of us. So the first question, and I may direct this a little bit to the neutrals who are on here, which is, well, so the question in general is, have you ever had an experience in mediation that has raised gender issues for you? And the way I was going to focus it for some of the neutrals here is, has there been a time where you think that your gender has helped or has hurt you in a mediation, where you think you were more heard, less heard, more useful, less useful? I guess in general to others, you know, what experiences have you had where gender has come up for you, or has it never come up for you? And do you have any comments? And then, you know, let's just also just throw into the mix Bronwyn's, and I don't mean to just put it on Bronwyn's, I think it's an incredibly good point, which is why I'm putting it, I mean, so she should get credit, but I don't mean it's just hers, is do we project our own biases as we're going into this and who we're choosing? So with all of that, who would like to speak? You might have to just unmute yourself. Oh, Bonnie, go for it.
No. Thanks. I thought you'd kill me if I didn't, Andrea. I think—
Right, I was going to throw you out of the car in the middle of 93 on Saturday.
So yes, I think to some extent, maybe it's the type of work that I do. It's a lot of employment work and a lot of high-end personal injury. I do, and a lot of parties who are women. And the only reason I raised my hand was because just before I came on here, I got off a mediation, a successful one, where the plaintiff was a widow, and it was all about the death of her husband. Well, as some of my colleagues from JAMS who went through the process with me very kindly 15 years ago when I lost my own husband, I think, you know, there's only women can be widows. I mean, men can be widowers, but the fact is, being a widow with a child, with a child or almost child, I was able to, I think to some extent, I worry about this sometimes. If you bring your own self to it, you don't want to say too much, but one of the individuals who was there knew me from before, because I had taught professional responsibility to her some years ago, just around the time that I lost my husband. So she knew that that was something that I could bring to the table, and to try to help this woman who was perseverating about getting justice for her husband, to kind of try to reverse engineer that, to get the noise of the case out of her head and help her to remember the very warm and wonderful relationship that she had with her husband. And so to some extent, I think being a woman is it's not just gender, but it's being able to maybe to have had a relatable experience. And that really resonates with the individual. And it was the defense lawyer who chose me because of, not only because she had mediated with me before, but because she knew this about my background, because I had taught her, but also, and she was right. She chose me not because I was a woman, but because I was a woman who she knew had this particular experience, and that maybe might be able to help this woman, breach not mix the tragedy of her loss with, going forward down the litigation road. And it was successful because I think to some extent I was able to tell her about how the process works. And in terms of, she's been a widow less time than I have, only 7 years as opposed to 15. But I think, and to tell her what it'll look like going ahead, that, the good stuff is easier to remember. And so I think to some extent that was very much an assistant, to her today to help her get that done. I was told by both parties it would never settle, but this was just the warm up for some later time. Well, that's not what happened.
Well, congratulations. And I know you have an excellent success rate in these. I won't throw you out of the car now, but
Sure.
But I think you make, such an excellent point, and it goes to Margaret's point about being in the Midwest, and something that Desiree and I spoke about, which is this relatable background. The idea that you're heard, that in mediation, you're trying to get people to agree. You, the mediators, are trying to get people to agree, that we, the advocates, are trying to get people to agree. And part of that is in being heard. And we mean fully heard, not just like being able to spew and that somebody else is receiving it, but to be heard and acknowledged. And sometimes that relatable background does it. So I'm going to, Margaret and Desiree, do you want to pick up on that, or does anybody else want to jump in?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the way I always thought about it is, if this mediation is a reiteration of the frustration that they already went through, and that not even just in the process, but who's involved. Meaning, if, again, going back to my Black female case, if I'm going back to that process and everybody in that room is a white denomination, and that's going to, again, just be a further reiteration of the frustrations that she went through to get there. And I think in creating the opportunity for success, you have to adjust and acknowledge, again, where that breakdown, again, comes from in terms of the sum of the situation, and do your best to address that, whether that's in the form of the mediator and the advocate, being a certain demographic, having that physical, visual representation during that process. I think it's all about how can we create that opportunity for common ground. And that not only requires you to go outside of the facts of the substance of what has happened, but the feelings and the emotions that went into that breakdown.
And
Anybody else want to speak to their experiences or raise questions or issues? Any of the other neutrals ever feel like their gender has played a role, as Bonnie slightly did? Or has anybody else felt maybe
Well,
marginalized?
I mean, it's definitely true that you can be in a mediation as a mediator. You can be in a mediation and, you know, the male lawyers are just kind of talking. And, you know, the female party is sitting there, you know, kind of being left out. And maybe I would notice that if I were a man, but I definitely notice it. And I'm like, okay, well, Miss So-and-so, you know, it's like, and she, you know, I think we all kind of realize at that moment that she was completely ignored in the previous conversation. And maybe I would have noticed it if I were a man. I don't know, because I'm not, but I did notice it. And there's almost like a conscious, like the guys actually see that, I think. Maybe I just project onto them. So that's definitely something that's happened.
Andrea, I'll share one experience that I had where I was really happy to have a female mediator, and then that mediator was Maria Walsh. And I had just come back from maternity leave and was viewing everything in a lens of gender. I mean, it's all I saw, really. And, you know, I think I was still like breastfeeding, and, you know, it was getting late into the night into this mediation, and things were getting really bad. And we came to an agreement in principle, and Maria and I were the only women in the room. Clients on both sides and counsel and everybody else were male. And all of a sudden, everybody had flights to catch and things to do, and everybody had to leave. And there Maria and I were, and I was literally kneeling at her computer, and we were typing out the term sheet because everybody was too busy to get it done. But she, you know, this is really about her because she was just so amazing. But I felt like she was going to make sure that I got out of there with the agreement that we had bargained for, and everybody was going to look good. And I saw it in a gender thing. It may not have been, but I felt like the only two women here are the ones who are going to get this done tonight. And here we are, and everyone's catching their flights and their trains.
And if I could follow up, the JAMS neutrals have heard me tell this story already at a meeting we had last week. But 2 weeks ago, I had a mediation, which went all day. It was by Zoom. And I think we started at 9:30 and went until 5:30. It was a mixed group of people on both sides, mixed gender, a number of people. I received the following morning from one of the participants on one side an email that told me that the counsel, the female counsel for one of the parties would no longer be involved in the case. We had some things we still had to work out because she had delivered a full-term baby at midnight that night. I had no idea. I had spent some time. I didn't know the woman before, but I always spend time, joint calls, individual calls before the mediation. There certainly would have been every opportunity for her to have mentioned something during the day. Absolutely nothing at all. She did an extraordinary job all day long.
That's
Wow.
amazing.
Andrea, I can't top that, but I can go back to the, one of the first issues that we discussed. I talked to, my assignment was in this panel was to talk about the role of gender in connection with the advocates in the room. But there have been some cases when I have had business women who are involved in a business divorce or a company, a startup that's about to be sold to a bigger company. And it's a really tough moment for founders. They want to make sure that they've got the money that represents all of their effort out of the acquirer, and often it inspires disputes pre-acquisition amongst the founders about who did what and who has contributed more. And I have found that in those founder discussions, there are sometimes gender issues that arise because the man is more willing to identify their contributions and be firm about it than the women when they're on their own. And I often find that some of the female founders that I've worked with are more apt to want to bring other people into the mediation, like a spouse or another business partner who will help recognize their contribution, who will affirm their contribution, which needs to be translated into money, right? So I've definitely, when it comes to it, on those occasions when I've had business women involved, and it's that sort of foundational valuation of everyone's sweat equity over years right before an acquisition, I've found some of that, some of those dynamics. But that gets back to the time-honored, I'm sure you guys see this in the employment arena, cliche almost, where women have trouble asking for raises, right? Or asking for, or speaking up in meetings or identifying their contributions. I've seen that in the context of business disputes when I've had business women involved very, very clearly. And that's very interesting to me, and I try to be sensitive to it.
So I'm going to actually ask a couple of kind of really hard questions at the end here. And if you want, we can turn off the recording if anybody wants to. But I'm going to get a little realer than we've even been getting. I have been in mediations where my client will say something about the other side that is sexist or racist. And there is an assumption on my client's part about, or the way that my client is hearing what the other side is saying, oh, she's one of those kind, right? Mm-hmm. There's also sometimes where my clients might have the perception that the other side, I'm going to just use a bad phrase, but you'll see why. And I really don't mean it to offend anybody, but my client will say, that the other side is perceiving me as an angry Black woman. How do we address those contexts? Because I am convinced, notwithstanding things, that gender still does, and gendered stereotypes come into play. The neutrals here, you must have heard things like that, unless everybody's on like their very best behavior, but and the advocates here, somebody saying, oh, that she's shrill or he's dominating, falling into those kinds of stereotypes. How do we deal with those things? And again, if you would like to comment and would not like it to be recorded, we can turn the recording off.
Well, Andrew, I can go with that. That does happen. That's, as real as it gets. And I think you said, does gender matter? It absolutely does. And I think some of the panelists have already said people need to recognize their own bias, because we all have them, good or bad, it happens. And I've absolutely been on that side of the situation on both sides. I've represented the alleged angry Black woman, or I've been on the side with the man who the woman, she's not aggressive, but that's how it's being perceived when they're just trying to, get their point across. Now, if that's my client, obviously you want to, not be prepared, because you can't be prepared for that in the situation, but you want to be able to take control of that and, manage the situation. And if it's I don't think I've had it where it's been the mediator calling the person that, but it's definitely been the other side. There's been, storm outs, and it gets really heated again, from my perspective, because of the topic, which is mostly, family matters. So when you're talking about family matters and children and money, things can get heated and people can, become passionate, as we say, or just downright angry, because sometimes they are angry. If you have a particular client who feels like they've given all in the marriage, that this is their stuff and they've done all of this and the other spouse has done very little, and just hearing that now they're going to have to share that, don't matter the years, you've been married 20 years, you got to share that with this person. It does get, angry, and we just have to have those conversations. Sometimes we take a step back, come back to the table. But sometimes it really is what it is. I mean, that's just been my perception. Sometimes they are angry, and sometimes people are just being, strong advocates, from themselves.
Andrea, I think one of the hardest things as a mediator is to get each side to see the other side's point of view and understand where they're coming from. And in the instance that you described, for example, maybe one approach would be finding a way to talk about why that might be, why they have that perception, what's going on in the other room that creates that perception. And are there facts that explain that perception that may not be, probably is not what's actually happening, but helps them sort of bridge that or get over that reaction, which is that reaction is just not, that's a roadblock, and you've got to sort of help them get past that. That is one of the real challenges as a mediator, I think. And it's not just racist or sexist comments, it's any belief about what's motivating the other side that makes it really hard for them to progress through that process.
Well, I love how people just jump in, so keep doing that. I'm gonna be quiet while somebody else jumps in.
I was just going to add a little bit to what Tiffany was saying, because, with a family law, it's definitely emotionally driven. A lot of times when I'm talking to clients, sometimes I'm on the call with them for 2 hours and it's not even legal advice. They just want to be, listened to, right? Or they just want to yell or something like that. So I can never say I've had a situation where I could recall at all, and I'm sure I would remember this, where a mediator blatantly said anything racial, along the racial lines or anything like that. But I've heard certainly, clients say to me that, the other side may think that, they may be the angry Black woman and that sort of thing. So jumping off what Mr. Neal was actually just saying, I also asked the question of why, because I want to make sure it's not something that they themselves are already preconceiving that the other side is thinking, but at the same time, there might be legitimate reasons why they do believe that the other side is indicating that about them. And if that is true, I think it's important that in the mediation, no matter how difficult the situation may be, whether or not you're angry, you're sad, it's very important to get your point across. Most definitely, it'll never be effective to get your point across if you're angry, you're yelling, at the other side. So I always just say, you've got to take a step back. If it's blowing steam, we got to take a moment. We got to step out because it's not going to serve anybody to be yelling, across the room. It's not. So I say, don't definitely, if it's true that the other side is thinking that about you, and you're not that, don't feed into that. Don't feed into it. Show them, show them something different. That's not you. And the mediator is going to see that that's, not you. And again, with a mediator, whether or not they think that or not, I guess we'll never know because things are sometimes, not always so explicit. But I definitely always look for certain cues that may show different biases. And if I do feel that way, making sure at all times I'm protecting my client, making sure my client is heard, and making sure that they're in the best light possible, just doing whatever I can to represent aggressively my client.
Andrea, what I would like to do is to put Judy Fabricant on the spot right now.
I have nothing to do with it.
As the former Chief Justice of the Superior Court, and having served during a time when many of these issues came to the forefront, and being part of discussions that addressed ways to meaningfully address them, and I'm talking about bias and a very broad scale here. I wonder if she would be willing to speak to some of the wisdom that she has as a result of having dealt with this during her last years as chief.
And I love that you put her on the spot. I would have liked to have done that if I felt comfortable.
Well, I'm not sure I have any particular wisdom, but I think one of the things we all need to recognize is that sometimes parties in litigation and in mediation are angry or sad or hurt or all kinds of other things. And when that sort of emotion happens to coincide with a stereotype about a certain identity that that person may have, whether it's gender or race or anything else, the coincidence can have the effect of depriving the person of the opportunity to express whatever emotion that person is feeling. And that's something that the depriving of the opportunity can be an obstacle to the process, just in the way that an inappropriate means of expressing the emotion can be an obstacle to the process. So I think one of the responsibilities of a mediator is to give people an opportunity to express what they're feeling appropriately without the identity issues getting in the way. So Andrea, I think your hypothetical was that the mediator said something that played into that stereotype. I certainly hope a mediator would never do that. But it would not be shocking if a party or a lawyer or somebody in the room was thinking that, whether they said it or not, or the mediator. And of course, the person who it's being thought about knows or suspects that other people are thinking it. And what I would hope the mediator would do is invite the person to express in an appropriate way whatever that person is feeling.
We have time for one or two more comments, and I did just get a text from Desiree, who apologizes her computer went out on her, so we lost her, but she, I'm so glad she was here for this. Does anybody want to say anything, any last comment or question before we wrap it up?
I'll just make kind of one observation from this whole discussion, including when we first started to put this program together. And I think Judge Fabricant's comments made me think of it a little differently. I think what we try to do in the consideration of who the mediator is and who's in the room is avoid triggers and not replicate the situation that, you know, that triggered the breakdown of the relationship. But you know, maybe there has to be room for anger, and it has to be expressed, but it has to be expressed in an appropriate way, because if you don't get that out, you might never get to closure. I had a mediation where I was actually the lawyer, not the mediator, and my client was just explosive. Somebody who retained me over the internet, and there was a lot of money, millions of dollars at stake. And we just had to put a pause on the mediation and then pursue it later. But so they're almost like two competing factors. You don't want to recreate the situation that triggered the breakdown, and yet there's all of this built up anger and emotion, and there has to be an appropriate way for it to be expressed.
And heard.
And heard.
I think that's really well said, Jessica.
Thank you.
Because you have to do both things. And I think to some extent your choice of the mediator, that should inform your choice of the mediator. Not that the mediator is going to be someone who, you know, helps you sing Kumbaya all day, but rather someone who is going to be able to help you do that messaging, you know, in a way, the anger, the whatever. There was actually, I had a case where the plaintiff clearly said to me, she said, the problem with the defendant is it's pale, male, and stale, which is something I've said many times about various things myself. And so I said, what you're saying is that on that, you know, on the high levels, you want me to communicate to them that the reason that you were treated the way you were is because they fundamentally, you know, don't relate to you. And, you know, we went through that. And so I went in and I said, well, she feels that that the higher ups are all kind of really out of touch because of the following. And she's really angry that she is now being perceived, and she told me to say this to them, as an uppity Black female who came in at one job, and the minute she started doing better and better, that's when they started squashing her because, And we, there was a way to do it, and a way to get that message across without, and saying she is legitimately angry, and here's why she's angry. And then I took their response and I went back to it and say, look, they started this organization. It's their baby. They realized that they maybe haven't grown as much as they should have in terms of, being, more diverse, but here's whatever. But they were literally in the room. She was in tears. The tears were so huge. They were literally rolling off the shiny table in jams. She was so upset.
Oh,
and I tried to convey that to them, that she is really, and then the other thing we have to think about too is the effect that eventually that has on the mediator, because I will tell you, I was so drained that night. And unfortunately, it was the same night that the occupant of the White House decided to take off on current congressmen women. And I ended up being a mess as a result of having been through the day with her. And then what happened that evening? I mean, I talked to Andrea after that. But the fact is, you have to be able to choose the person who can convey those same messages without, and this is really true, as Judge Neal said, because that's the emotions that's blocking it. And you need to be able to choose a mediator who is going to be a messenger in a way that is productive, again, so that the message gets heard on both sides. And they don't just, see, I told you that's what they're like. That's not very helpful to the mediator. So the mediator has to really have a soft touch. And you don't always get to have that, even as the mediator. That's why cases don't settle if you can't get the messages heard in a way that's productive.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you everybody who participated and offered comments. And I hope you all found this as interesting as I did. Lots of perspectives that I hadn't really thought about, lots of dynamics of mediation itself, I think, that have come to play that are very thoughtful and useful. I will say that we are incredibly fortunate here in Massachusetts with the mediators that we have, many of whom are here on this. There are phenomenal mediators at JAMS. There are phenomenal mediators not at JAMS, including Jessica and a mutual friend of ours, Bette Roth. So I do feel like we're very fortunate here. I will, however, say that we don't have a lot of racial and ethnic diversity among our mediators. And insofar as people think that that's important for some of the reasons that we've discussed, it would be nice if we could recruit into mediation the same way that we recruit into judgeships or into partnerships or into any of the professorships and all of those other things. Because I think somebody used the phrase earlier, representation sometimes matters. And the more choices people have, whether for biased reasons or practical reasons, the better everybody gets served in our overall legal system and dispute resolution. So I will just say that we were going to talk about how to become a mediator. We're not going to talk about that. We're actually going to end 2 minutes ago. But there was a program on that. And if people want to have more programs on that, happy to work on that in the future, far future, because I got to catch up. But I do think that we need to be recruiting into mediation in the same way that we've recruited into everything else, that a diversity of experiences, a diversity of voices, a diversity of choices makes every process better, including mediation. So I'll just leave it on that note. I do want to say to people, thank you very, very much. I really did have loved this, and I have loved working with this panel. Thank you, JAMS. I'd like to say you owe us all some wine sometimes, and we'll all come over. And I know that you would all be happy to do that. And I know that Conna will get them to host us at some point. So come back again, and you can enjoy the party for this program. Thank you all.
And thank you, Andrea. Amazing.
Thank you, Andrea, for the
amazing moderation. I knew it, but here it was.
It was great.
It's easy to moderate a very intelligent and thoughtful panel.
The one thing I would add is everybody, don't forget about the American Bar Association's Resolution 105, which was passed about 2 years ago, supporting increased diversity in ADR. It was specifically addressed to that. It's available on if you Google it through the ABA, and it's got a great report that outlines the problem of recruitment, of panels, and all of the biases and why it's important to work on this issue. So I encourage everybody to Resolution 105, American Bar Association, it'll come up. Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.